Last week, I experimented with using superglue and isopropyl alcohol to create the subtle appearance of veins under the surface of a character's skin. Today, I'll use the same principles found in that video to create a gnarly skin pattern on a grief-bound monster. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. The main difference between achieving a subdermal vein effect and creating a skin pattern that appears on the surface of the skin is the amount of acrylic paint that we use in the process. For veins, we want a very light layer of paint. This will make the end result look as if the veins are under the skin surface. For today's skin pattern, we'll use a more opaque layer of paint for a more pronounced look. I prepare the miniature using Monument Hobby's dark purple primer. This is much easier than priming the model black and then brushing on a layer of dark plum, which is what I normally do. I am using an airbrush extensively for this paint up. You don't have to use an airbrush, but for my own personal sanity, it's really the only choice. There are so many details to paint here that I can't imagine the amount of time it would take to manually paint each and every attribute. I know that some people consider slapchop to be the final word in speed painting, but you really can't beat an airbrush for speed and efficiency. I'm starting with the lighter skin tones and then working my way up to darker hues as I move away from the center of the miniature. Anywhere where I want this skin pattern to be will have to remain light. The pattern that we layer on top of this wouldn't be as visible over a darker layer. These aren't just shadows that I'm adding, I want the color of the flesh to transition to a much darker hue as it nears the end of each tentacle. On smaller, less complicated miniatures, the airbrush doesn't necessarily save that much time in the grand scheme of things. However, on a piece like this with so much surface area to paint, an airbrush is a lifesaver. I also like using an airbrush when batch painting several miniatures at once. It may not save a significant amount of time on an individual small miniature, but when used over the course of painting 10 to 20 minions, the speed advantage is unbeatable. The last base color that I'm applying through the airbrush is muted pink ink. This will add some color variety to the creature's skin. For these areas, I'll have to use a darker color for the pattern so it's visible over this pink layer. It's a little odd giving a vile monstrosity such as this a Rudolph red nose, but the final appearance will be toned down a bit as we continue to layer colors. Now for the fun part. We're going to use a couple of common household items to aid us in achieving this mottled skin look. First, I need to use liquid superglue to protect the foundation colors for the skin. And I'm using a cheap plastic paintbrush from the dollar store that I can toss once I'm done with it. I make sure to use liquid superglue instead of gel glue. This allows the glue to flow over the surface of the model in a thin layer, and it still protects the underlying paint just as well as the thick stuff. This liquid superglue will still flow into the recesses somewhat, and you will lose some of the texture on the miniature, but it doesn't seem to negatively impact the final appearance of the project. I'm covering every surface where I want the pattern to appear on the skin, and even a little beyond. The second household item that we're using for this project is isopropyl alcohol. The alcohol will remove paint from any surface that isn't protected by the superglue, so we want to be thorough. Once the superglue has thoroughly dried, I use 3 muted ink colors for the irregular skin motif. I'm going to use a very light layer of muted pink over all of the bright glacier blue areas. I really like these muted colors for the appearance of subcutaneous veins because the hues aren't very bright. I imagine that the translucent flesh would diminish the intensity of the color of any organs beneath. Of course, with this guy, I'm creating a pattern on the surface of the skin, but I thought I'd still throw that idea out there. It's how I originally settled on these 3 colors. For the areas where the glacier blue skin transitions to wolf gray, I'll apply a layer of muted green. I also use this around the outer edges of the muted pink base layer, not necessarily around all of the pink that we just applied. It's perfectly okay to blend this into that pink though. These colors will blend a little bit once we introduce the isopropyl alcohol into the mix, which hopefully creates a natural looking transition between the colors. The final color that I'm adding is muted gray. This is a neat color because it's dark enough to remain visible over the muted pink, but it also has a very pronounced violet hue to it. In the past, I've tried using muted violet over the muted pink, but the 2 colors are much too similar. This muted gray provides me with the look I'm after. Now it's time to break out the isopropyl alcohol and start developing our skin pattern. This is when the real work begins. Up to this point, every step in the process has been super fast and efficient. With this alcohol step, I need to be mindful of how I'm creating this pattern. I'm using the alcohol to draw various shapes into the topmost layer of paint. This doesn't just remove the paint, it moves the pigment to the outermost region of the alcohol puddle. This intensifies the pigment density at that location and is what brings about the shapes in the pattern. For the most part, I begin with small circles, but I adjust these shapes as necessary to create a more interesting design. Since I'm working in only a very small section at a time, this step is quite time consuming, at least when compared to what we've done so far. Still, this is so much easier than painstakingly drawing all of these fine lines all over the miniature with a standard fine-tipped brush. An alternative approach to this process would be to complete each one of these color layers one at a time. In other words, you could spray the layer of pink, use the isopropyl alcohol on it, and then immediately protect it with more superglue. Then you'd move on to the green and do the same thing. This result would be more of a layered line pattern rather than color transitions within the lines. I like this idea for creating veining because it looks like the different colored veins represent how far below the surface of the skin they are. Today, however, I'm going for maximum efficiency because we have a lot of ground to cover. Once I'm satisfied with the composition of the lines, I hit the miniature with a coat of clear matte varnish. This superglue is very glossy, and I'm not confident that the subsequent layers of acrylic paint will adhere to it very well. So this wraps up the skin portion of this tutorial. I am so happy with the way this looks, considering the amount of effort we put into it. I will press on with the rest of this miniature painting tutorial for those who are interested. But before that, for those of you who are leaving right now, I'd like to quickly thank my channel members for supporting what I do on this channel. You too can become a channel member for as little as $1.99 per month using the link in the description below, and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you choose which miniature I paint next. Alright, let's get on with painting the Devourer for Grimcoven. I start painting the eyes by base coating them with Scarlet Blood Game Color. Then I use a series of 3 yellow paint colors to paint the iris of the eye. I pulled up a reference photo of an eye to see what the pattern was like, and what I found there is no pattern. The colors within the iris are very irregular, so I decide to paint each of the 3 yellow colors haphazardly within the red of the eye. I still form a circle for the iris, but I make sure not to completely cover the red base layer or any of the previous yellow colors that came before. I line the outside of the iris with Death Reaper, and I also use Death Reaper to paint a bit of a star-shaped pupil within the iris. And I use it to line the outside of the eye anywhere where I see that it needs to be cleaned up. Finally, I use titanium white to add a specular highlight that is half within the pupil and half extending into the iris. To finish up the skin, I use a dry brush to stipple Payne's Gray on the tentacles. I apply this beyond the reach of the pattern that we worked so hard to create previously. I also use the Payne's Gray to completely darken the tips of each tentacle. All of the metal objects over the Devourer's body get a thorough coat of Death Reaper. This is the foundation for the rust effects and metallic paints that will follow. The tongue and tentacle underbellies get a coat of Dark Plum Pro Acryl. Yes, I replaced the Dark Plum Pro Acryl with Dark Violet Primer earlier in the project. No, I have not and will not completely abandon Dark Plum Pro Acryl. The rest of the unpainted items get a coat of German Camel Black Brown. This includes any fabric on the beast and the base of the model and the teeth. I'm going to lightly brush Vallejo Purple over the dark plum on the tentacle bellies. I've devoted most of my time and energy to creating the creature's awesome looking skin, and now I'm just trying to get through the rest of the paint job without losing my mind. The next step for the tentacles is to highlight with Magenta Pro Acryl. I have one more highlight after this to make the tentacles look shiny. I'm highlighting fairly aggressively without any color mixing or blending between layers. While I have these colors on my palette, I decide to start adding some color to the tongues. I'm going to highlight both the tentacles and the tongues with ice yellow, so I figured this is a good time to get the tongue up to speed. Once I have the magenta in place, I use Vallejo Purple to create a transition between the magenta and dark plum on the tongue. Then I darken the tips of the tongues with Payne's Gray Pro Acryl. Now I highlight both the tongue and the tentacles with ice yellow. On the tongue, I try to follow the sculpted ridges for the highlights. If the yellow ever looks too stark or I get too sloppy with it, I can always use the underlying color thinned way down with water to glaze it back a bit. When it comes to highlighting the tentacles, I just go for it. These are small, bright highlights, and I don't bother adjusting them in any way. I'm using Dirty Down Rust for the rust effect on the metal objects. I warm the rust and the model with a space heater on my painting desk. Then I apply the Dirty Down Rust directly over the Death Reaper paint on all of the metallic items. I leave the space heater on my desk as I continue to work. Keeping the model and the rust warm is crucial for it to bloom properly. Before I finish painting all of the metal accent pieces, I first need to paint the internal glow of the lanterns. This begins with an opaque layer of titanium white. Oh, and I also use titanium white to base coat the drool and tears emanating from the creature's orifices. It's a bit of a sidestep, but now is when I decide to finish up the watery secretions with a little turquoise ink. And back to the lanterns. I base coat the glass of every lantern with fluorescent yellow ink. Then I use flame orange ink to paint an arch in the upper portion of every pane of glass on every lantern. We're beginning to see why this model took me so long to paint. There is just so much going on here. I finished the lantern glow with crimson ink. I paint this in just the uppermost outer edges of the glass. If any areas are looking rough, I return to fluorescent yellow to glaze over the two darker colors. I use the fluorescent yellow as a glaze in this case, but it's so naturally transparent that I don't need to thin it at all. The final touch for the lanterns is to clean them up with some Death Reaper. This is mostly for the thin strips of metal that run between each pane of glass. I was not about to try to use Dirty Down Rust on these ultrafine details. I'm using Necrotic Flesh by the Army Painter for all of the teeth. This paint is translucent enough that I can create a nice gradient from the German camo black-brown to the full opacity of the Necrotic Flesh with just a few thin coats. I then highlight the teeth with ice yellow. I dry brush bright gold by the Army Painter over any metallic objects that I want to be gold. Gold and rust together don't make for the best color combination, but I want this thing to look grimy. The rust achieves that. I use Army Painter gunmetal for the chains that are dangling all over the Griefbound's body. I'm going to make a mess out of the base with Army Green paint, Muted Violet ink, and Necrotic Flesh by the Army Painter. There really isn't much visible real estate on this base, so I'm choosing muted colors that won't detract from the rest of the piece. I'm using burnt orange as a primary mid-tone color for the fabric items, or dare I say clothing, of this creature. I'm stippling this into place so that the underlying black-brown layer has an impact on the final color. I'm building up to full opacity only on the raised folds and upward-facing areas. I highlight the chin cloth with a mix of burnt orange and ice yellow. I'm not adding any additional highlights to the rear of the model. For the final touch, I use a toothpick to slap some Uhu glue around the teeth and tongues. Well, that wraps up painting the Devourer for the Grimcoven board game. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of gluttons.